Joining me today in Studio Q is William Gibson. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Very well. Glad to be here.
Nice to have you here. William, your last three books were set in the present, but with this one, you've gone back to the future, so to speak. Why did you want to do that?
Well, the last three I thought of as speculative novels of the very recent past. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, I wrote them because I felt I needed to recalibrate the whatever metric or yardstick of weirdness I use to sense how strange the world is now. I decided that I was essentially working with an 80s yardstick.
And that brings up an interesting point, because you've said in the past that writers need to use a science fiction toolkit to assess the present. What do you mean by that?
Well, I couldn't give you an entire, even a partial list of those tools, but the tools for writing rigorously extrapolated science fiction are quite specific.
Right.
And since so much of the world we live in feels now like science fiction, why not try using those tools to describe contemporary reality?
So the current world has become as absurd as science fiction potentially should have been in the 1970s and 80s.
Well, it's become somehow as strange to us even now as science fiction. Although we've all long since grown a bit numb to the cognitive dissonance, but occasionally something will happen and we'll still go, that was really weird.
And that was really weird is what's interesting, because you famously coined the term cyberspace, but you have predicted aspects of the digitally connected world we live in today, especially in your early writing. Do you feel like the digital world has turned out the way that you predicted or that you expected it would?
Well, I'm credited for my hits, and I'm totally given a pass on my misses.
That sounds pretty good.
And I know, but I wind up with this undeserved reputation for prescience. So my first novel has something vaguely like the internet happening in around 2035, and no cell phones. Mm-hmm. There are no cell phones in my imagined 2035. So that's a miss, and that's a huge miss. And if you concentrate on that, you could easily dismiss my prescience, which in fact is what I tend to do. I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm actually trying to use science fiction to somewhat understand an unthinkable present.
But saying that, so many authors, I don't think anyone necessarily thinks of you as a fortune teller. So many authors have tried to speak about what a future would look like. You definitely came much closer than any other writer. But I should say, you did tell Salon Magazine recently that you never imagined Facebook would ever happen, for example.
Yeah, there is nothing in my earliest concepts of cyberspace that resembles social media. Give it, 4 or 5 novels on, and there are things that can be read as foreshadowings of social media, but only by like a year or two, or for that matter, foreshadowings of reality television, which I'm actually a bit prouder of than the cyberspace stuff.
But given that you've come closer than anyone else, how did you do it? How did you go about predicting cyberspace? How did you go about predicting reality TV?
I looked for bits and pieces of the future, possible bits and pieces of the future that might have arrived early.
Right.
And for reality TV, I was watching the first season of Cops and letting my imagination go crazy on imagining a day in which all television was descended from Cops.
And
And I arrived at something called Cops in Trouble, which was a reality show about cops in one or another kinds of very deep personal trouble, where that cop that cop would become the star of the season, be it his messy divorce or his recently discovered drug dealing career. But these would be real people doing real things, and in the world of the novel, they became huge celebrities and often had subsequent careers as television hosts, for instance.
But you did say you're not a soothsayer.
Yeah.
But again, you've gotten more right than most. And you did say in an interview about 20 years ago that you were optimistic that the internet could be kept free of corporate government control. Recent developments like the Edward Snowden leaks show that hasn't been the case. So what extent have developments over the last 20 years changed your personal view of the web?
Well, I would say I would make it 30 years in all, because it's 30 years since the publication of Neuromancer in 1984. And I think that the big difference is that when I coined the term cyberspace, I coined it to define another realm, this other kind of space where certain things happen, as opposed to here where we are in the real world. What's happened in 30 years is that the other place, what we used to call cyberspace, has colonized this place that we used to call the real world, and the distinction has become completely archaic. So I think cyberspace is a heritage term, but so is, quote, the real world.
In your new novel, in The Peripheral, people take for granted that they are under surveillance all the time. It's not a gigantic leap from where we are today. Why do you think we as a society have become so casual about surveillance?
I think it's the texture of the wave of emergent technology we're living through. And emergent technologies, I take it for granted, are the most powerful change drivers, one way or another, however indirectly, in human society, and have been for a long time. And somehow the one that we're all in today seems to involve a tolerance, a kind of inherent tolerance for the idea that all of these things we do on the web are being tracked.
And do you personally worry about that?
I don't worry about it so much in terms of it affecting me directly, but I do wonder professionally and personally about where that's ultimately going.
And the reality of your scenarios is pertinent, especially when you look in The Peripheral at something called the Jackpot, the giant environmental and social collapse, the Jackpot. How much do you worry something like that could become real?
Well, I mean, I tend more to worry about anyone who's convinced that something like that has no chance of happening.
What do you mean?
Well, people who assume that something like the Jackpot in the book, which is a very long-term, multi-causal, complexly systemic apocalypse, basically, but it's an apocalypse that takes 40 or 50 years to be over, and it's preliminary stages may have taken 400 or 500 years. So to get the ball rolling, we don't have a cultural concept to fit around that, because that's not our apocalypse. But if I met someone who looked at that and said, "Oh no, there's absolutely no way that's going to happen,"
Right.
I would think, what have you been doing?
Maybe you should be a little bit more worried.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Peripheral depicts a very bleak future, William. Life is much harder for the poor. The world is destroyed ecologically. But do you have any cause for optimism? Does this book reflect how you feel about what could be waiting for us over the next few decades, to your point? Are you optimistic about the future?
Well, I think it's a possibility. And
What is? The bleak existence or the happiness?
no, I think that something like the Jackpot is a possibility, and I think that a great many people in the world are increasingly concerned about it. Much as in the way in my 20s, everyone who knew anything about anything was constantly concerned about the possibility of nuclear war to extinction, which was not a ridiculous fear. We now know just how close we came a couple of times, though we weren't told at the time. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen the way we all expected it to happen. And this one, I don't know. This is we're facing something different today. It's very complex. Whatever it is has mostly already happened, and we don't seem to be able to agree on the nature of that or what we can do politically about it. But so it's the zeitgeist's current anxiety.
But to that point, as a writer, though, do you think it's possible to write a great work of science fiction these days that is optimistic, that isn't dystopian?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think that technically, I think that it's probably possible that someone could write a utopian novel in 2014. A utopian novel is the opposite of a dystopian
Of course, yeah.
novel, but both of them are absolutes. Neither the utopian nor the dystopian really involve any relativity or much in the way of nuance. And if you go like, I'm writing a utopia, but there are a lot of the people in it are really unhappy and leading miserable, oppressed existences. That's not a utopia, but it is kind of like our world, in that a lot of people right now today are totally enjoying the way it's going for them, and a lot of people in the world are miserable and oppressed and not having a good time.
Mm-hmm.
So the world around us is neither dystopian nor utopian. It's just the world. It's a melange of the two.
But it's certainly more of a realistic, whether you're writing dystopian or utopian futuristic fiction, it's definitely very different than not that long ago when there was the Jetsons and Buck Rogers, jetpacks and flying cars and Back to the Future and hoverboards. Do you think that it's a good thing or a bad thing that maybe some of that cartoonish hope is gone?
The cartoonish hope, I don't know. I think the Jetsons was possible.
Yeah.
Because it was possible because everybody, even little kids, already knew that capital F future of the 1950s was a hokey impossibility.
Really?
Yeah, they knew. The people who made the Jetsons knew that.
Yeah.
It's like a mild kind of parody of of that. The Back to the Future movies, I don't know.
But there have been accuracies in the Jetsons. Video calling, robot vacuum cleaners. These things did come
Yeah,
true.
but they were picking up the Sunday supplement version of groovy imaginary futures. It wasn't that they had actual
Sure.
Jetsons futurists extrapolating the Roomba, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know what, at this point, I don't know what a kind of really upful, positive imaginary future would look like. It would have to solve an awful lot of problems very convincingly in order to have any ground to stand on. And it used to be we could just sort of shoot the good guys into space and they would start over,
Right.
regardless of what Earth had become. And we actually seem to, I suspect we're starting to outgrow that. We're starting to realize that this is actually the only planet in our solar system that we can live on.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think it may be the start of a kind of maturity. I mean, through the entire 20th century, the phrase "the 21st century" was constantly uttered.
Right.
It was like an invocation. Little kids didn't know it was a number of words. It was just this thing, and it was always the 21st century.
Right.
And how often in the actual 21st century do you hear anyone refer to the 22nd century? It has no resonance. There's no ring to it. It's never mentioned. It's as though culturally we've given up and we don't have that idea of the next century being an entirely other place.
Just fascinating. Just one final question, and thank you for coming in. Your work, especially Neuromancer, which you mentioned, has influenced so much science fiction. Your influence shows up in films like The Matrix. How does it feel when you see so many other people taking up your vision?
I feel as though I'm part of a great mosaic, because if I could give, not that I ever would, but if I could give guided tours
Right.
of the text of Neuromancer and have a wand and point things out, and I could say, well, I got this from Harlan Ellison, and I got this from Robert Sheckley, and I got this from some comic book I saw when I was 8 years old, and this was from a Lou Reed song. And
What was from a Lou Reed song?
oh, they're bits and pieces of Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, and particularly Steely Dan lyrics, all over Neuromancer. None of those being very fashionable at the time I wrote the book. They were all rather old things, but I was just drawing on them. They're bits of Bruce Springsteen and the bits of Springsteen's Nebraska in kind of symbolic bits in the book. So I've always felt that I was working with borrowings and found objects and random junk of the world. So my product becomes borrowings and found objects and part of the random junk of the world.
And now those are borrowing from you,
Yeah.
as part of that random junk.
Yeah, and that's why that's how I see it as a tapestry, because someone will borrow from them again and again and again, and it just goes on that way for however long it does.
William Gibson, thanks so much for coming in today.
Thank you.